There are reports coming out all the time from other countries on fracking, and this, it seems every 2 days in the office there's another one. And actually treating this as an interim report is going to give us a chance to digest some more of those. So tomorrow in my office, work begins on the second phase, which will produce the second report. So what is fracking? Well, it's a contraction of the term hydraulic fracturing, which is quite a mouthful, so it's understandable why it's been condensed to fracking. It's basically using pressurised liquid to crack rock in the same way as hydraulic brakes use a pressurised liquid to transmit force. And it is a complete coincidence that frack rhymes with crack. There are many concerns around it. The contamination of groundwater being a major environmental concern, also concerns about earthquakes, greenhouse gases. Many of these concerns, as we've talked to people, are not actually specifically environmental, they're economic. Who would really get jobs from expansion of the oil and gas industry? Would it be skilled people from overseas? Would it be the unemployed in these places, for example? But why fracking? So just at a very high level, oil and gas are found in porous rock. That means rock that's got holes in it like a sponge. With conventional drilling, the rock is not only porous, it is also permeable. In other words, the holes that are joined up, and that's a picture up there. And the way conventional drilling works is the drill goes through an impermeable cap rock, which is holding the oil and gas down there, into the porous and permeable rock holding the oil and gas, and then the oil and gas comes out. The reason for using fracking is when the rock is porous, holding oil and gas, but it's not permeable. There's the second picture up there, and fracking basically creates cracks joining up the holes. It's been around for quite a while. I discovered, to my bit of amusement, that the first high-time hydraulic fracturing was used in the world was when I was actually 3 days old. Although the kind of fracking used now is very different, and it's much larger in scale. The first one in New Zealand was 23 years ago. So how does it actually work? Basically, the same as any other well, drilling down through different layers of rock and aquifers. The well must be cased in steel and then cement, which fills the gap between the steel and the surrounding rock. Then what's called a perforating gun is put down, and that shoots little holes in the casing. Then the fracking fluid is injected at high pressure. That comes out through those holes and creates the cracks. And if you picture a vertically drilled well, because some of them are actually horizontal now, they go down and around, but the vertically drilled well, what are those cracks like? They're a few millimetres wide, they are tens of metres deep, and they can be hundreds of metres long, so they have that kind of shape. Then the next stage that happens is that a lot of the fracking fluid returns, and that's in red on the diagram. The oil and gas start to flow, and that's in black, and there's usually both of them involved. And the other thing that comes up is what the industry actually term brine, which is salty water from far below the earth. It is water that is saltier than the sea. It's the blue there on the diagram. And that can contain heavy metals and hydrocarbons and all sorts of other stuff. And that brine coming out continues over the production lifetime of the well. That is not unique to fracking. In conventional oil and gas drilling, that brine comes out as well. So fracking in New Zealand, three kinds that we need to think about. The first one is what has happened so far, which has been in Taranaki, and it's known as tight sands fracking. So the conventional drilling in Taranaki involves drilling into sandstone, and when that sandstone is not as permeable as is needed for the oil and gas to come out readily, they use fracking, and it's called tight sands fracking for the obvious reason, because the sandstone's a bit tight. The second thing, which has actually happened in New Zealand to a much more limited extent, is what's known as coal seam gas fracking. And oil and gas, natural gas, are produced together, but gas, particularly methane, is also produced along with coal, and you can crack the coal to get the methane out. That has been done in a pilot project in Waikato by Solid Energy. It was done earlier in Southland at Ojai in 1995, but it was unsuccessful. But there is potential in many places across the country, particularly Canterbury, Otago, Southland, but a lot of other places too. The third thing, which we have not seen anything of yet, at the moment we're seeing a few exploration wells beginning, is what's known as the East Coast shale fracking. And this is more analogous to the kind of fracking that has gone on in the United States, fracking shale for gas. Here it would be by the East Coast, talking the North Island East Coast, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, and Wairarapa. And that, as I said before, just initial exploration. So we have yet to see that happen. The coal seam gas, going back to that for a moment, that is the one that has been done in Australia. So you can't actually just think about fracking in isolation from the whole process of oil and gas production, because that's all intimately linked together. And in the report, we actually lay out on a couple of chapters under these headings, taking people through the process of a well from birth to death. So where to drill, establishing the drill site, drilling the well, fracking the well, if that happens, and then the flow back, which is that multicoloured thing that was on the diagram, the red and the black and the blue, and that is the transition into the productive life of the well, which can last 10, 20, 30 years. And then all the way along the process, waste must be dealt with, both solids and liquids, and then finally the well is abandoned. Now, many of the concerns, and indeed many, including the environmental impacts around fracking, are not actually associated with the actual process of fracking, the actual business of putting the fracking fluid in and creating the cracks. But what fracking does is provide the potential for scaling up of the oil and gas industry and its expansion into new parts of the country. So scaling up within and beyond Taranaki. And so it does mean that other environmental impacts or risks that are associated with oil and gas production outside of fracking are also going to accumulate in this issue of cumulative risk. So you can't just look at the fracking bit separately from the rest. For example, the second to last thing on that slide, talking about waste, dealing with the waste. If fracking enables a big scaling up of the industry, there's going to be a lot of waste to get rid of, and it's going to be possibly waste in parts of the country that don't have any history of oil and gas production. The big concern around contamination of groundwater, concerns around earthquakes. I have not yet seen any big alarm bells around what has happened so far in Taranaki, but there's a caveat. I don't yet know how well monitoring has been done, but my main conclusion is that there is low risk if everything is done in line with best practice. And what do I mean by best practice? Well, cutting to the chase, there are 4 things that you need to do well, 4 things that must be got right if you are to avoid or reduce these environmental risks. You don't always eliminate them totally. The first one is watching where you drill. Keeping away from active faults, because it's not so much the process of fracking itself that is the earthquake risk, it's when you have liquid that if it gets into a stressed fault, an active fault, we get 2 pieces of rock hard up against each other, and if they're forced apart slightly by liquid, then they can slide. You want to keep away from important aquifers. Obviously there are people issues on the surface as well that have to be managed about where you drill. The second one is what's known as the integrity of the well. There are multiple steel casings required. A lot of the problems, some problems in America have been where there were no casings or poor casing of wells. And I referred earlier to the gap between the casing, steel casings, and the rock being filled by cement. It's very important that that cement leave no holes, that it be bonded well to the rock. That's no small thing to do. It also needs to be able to withstand ground movements, of which we have rather a lot in New Zealand. So You don't want a situation where wells can leak. And this is key to avoiding water contamination where problems have occurred overseas. The third thing you need to absolutely get right is avoiding spills and leaks on the surface. Now, that might seem pretty obvious and pretty straightforward, but again, it has caused problems overseas. There are concerns around substances that are in fracking fluid, which are toxic, and it's worth bearing in mind that when fracking fluid is trucked to the site, the different components are trucked and mixed just before they're injected in, that is when those components are at their highest concentration. So you definitely don't want spills there where they can go into groundwater. So that might sound straightforward, but there's a thing called human error. The next fourth thing that is important to get right is dealing with waste. Now this is a photo of what's called a re-injection well. There's all kinds of waste from drilling. There's the drill cuttings themselves, the rock cuttings, the drilling mud, which is stuff that's used to ease the drilling process. There's the returning fracking fluid. The biggest in volume really is the salty water, this brine that I referred to earlier that comes up with the oil and gas, and that comes up over the lifetime of the well. So there's a separation of these wastes into solids and liquids. In Taranaki, what happens with the liquids, which is the greater volume, most of it is re-injected back into the ground, putting it back into the ground rather than putting it in rivers and lakes, which is a good thing. But if that re-injection is done poorly, again, you risk contaminating groundwater and there's a risk of triggering earthquakes. Climate change. This, in my mind, is what is the biggest environmental issue of all, and is an active debate worldwide over whether fracking helps or hinders. Natural gas is the most benign of the fossil fuels. It has the lowest carbon dioxide emissions when it is burnt and the energy is extracted. It is about half as bad as coal, or twice as good as coal. And so one side of this argument goes more gas from fracking, less coal, and particularly the experience in the United States is cited in that regard. One can see how that would be a very good thing in China. But with the United States, what has happened there, more gas from fracking there, and now we have reports of cheap coal from the US coming to Europe and sending up emissions there. So you've basically got a very complex mix of global markets and relative prices worldwide. These things are traded internationally. But at the other side of the argument is that if you've got more gas and indeed oil from fracking, you are displacing investment in renewables. So is fracking a bridge to a low carbon future or not? That is difficult, if not impossible to answer, which is why an ETS with a strong price signal is so critically important. So talked about the four things you have to get right. Talked about climate change, which sort of sits outside those other environmental impacts because it's a different kind of environmental impact. Three aspects of government oversight and regulation that I'm left with concerns about. That oversight is complex and fragmented. It's difficult to see where accountabilities lie. I think that for us, it was a major exercise writing the chapter, simply describing it. By the time you trawl through MB and High Hazards Unit and Crown Minerals and the EPA and the MFE, and then you've got regional councils and district councils and all sorts of bits being looked after in that way. The fact that flaring of gas, for example, that the discharge to air that might result is the business of a regional council, but the lights, the glare from it is the responsibility of the district council. So it's very, it took a lot of effort to actually simply describe that. And I think that when you get this complexity and fragmentation, not only does the public find it difficult to engage and to understand, but there is a risk of things falling between the cracks, if you will excuse the pun. The second concern I have that regulation may be too light-handed. A very high-ranking official in the International Energy Agency recently talked publicly about how, when it comes to fracking, just trust us has not proved to be good enough. And so I think that what we want to do in the second phase of this report is to examine that aspect of regulation more closely. And of course I'm aware that today the government has released its revisions to regulations under the Health and Safety Employment Act, to oil and gas regulations. The third one is what a bit of a curious phase, what the industry in fact coined the term, a social licence to operate. But that is yet to be earned. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to get all of the public agreeing or approving, but the level of distrust of this technology is pretty high and widespread, and concerns are very, as I said earlier. And that public trust needs to be earned, if it is to be earned. For example, full disclosure of the components of fracking fluid is the sort of thing that would help earn that public trust. So I have made in this interim report, indeed an interim conclusion, it's not my last word on the subject though, and that conclusion, Nikki actually read it out earlier, echoes that of the United Kingdom Royal Society, which put out a report earlier this year, which was said by a lot of people to have given a big tick to fracking. That is not the case. You read it carefully, it's certainly not the case. What it says is that these environmental risks can be managed, provided, and that proviso is up there. And why we need to, the focus of the second phase of that investigation will be investigating that proviso in New Zealand. Whether best practice is actually being implemented and enforced through regulation. So somehow or other I would like to satisfy myself that that is the case. My impression of Taranaki is that and this is only in regard to community relationships, is that it is varied between companies. So some may be doing extremely well, some may not. There's rather a lot of companies involved now. So, but I think where this gets really interesting and difficult is this, that we can't simply say things have gone more or less okay in Taranaki bar a few glitches, because that's what it appears, although we'll have a closer look at that. And you can't just say that and extrapolate from there into the coal seam gas and the shale fracking in other parts of the country. The oil company executive who earlier this year was reported as saying that the east coast of the North Island could become the Texas of the South, I don't think he realised that this would not gladden the hearts of many New Zealanders. This photo actually isn't Texas, it's Wyoming, but there are similar photos coming out of the coal seam gas fracking in Australia. I hope that there is no possibility that Hawke's Bay will end up looking like this, but I want to make sure, which is why I need to do more work. And going back to those two ways in which fracking could expand beyond Taranaki, addressing first the shale in the North Island East Coast. Hawke's Bay, Gisborne and Wairarapa are very different from Taranaki. First of all, there's the shale rather than the tight sands, but the geology is different. You're fracking shale, the rocks are much more folded and faulted. There's different hydrogeology, it's drier, there's much heavier reliance on important aquifers, and of course it's more seismically active. So it's different, it's very different. So I'm saying you can't just simply extrapolate from Taranaki. The second thing is the coal seam gas, where there's potential in much of the country. Again, if that was to be obtained through fracking in Canterbury, Otago, Southland, these places, again they're very different from Taranaki. For one thing, coal seam gas fracking takes place at much shallower depths than the other kinds of fracking, and so you are much more in the vicinity of aquifers. So where do I get to with all of this? I'm not calling for a moratorium at this stage. Recommending a moratorium is a big thing to do, and it's not something I would do lightly. It's a business here employing lots of people, livelihoods at stake, but I am the Environment Commissioner, so the environment must be my primary concern. As I said earlier, I have not seen anything yet that sets off major alarms. I do see that in other parts of the environment. Anything that is of high and urgent concern, I've not seen that yet, but that's not to say everything has been done perfectly so far. If during the second phase I do discover things that are sufficiently worrying, or think that the regulation is very inadequate, I will not hesitate to call for a moratorium. So while this is an interim report, it does contain a great deal of information on fracking, what it is, how it works, what really matters for reducing environmental risks, and the roles that are played by central and local government. As with all our reports, we have striven to write it in plain English, and hopefully it will foster a more informed debate. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.